is 0. What do we get? What is the only critical number? Because this is never undefined. What is the only critical number here? X equals when is a fraction 0? I know I asked that 5 times already.
When the numerator is 0, which is when x is 0.
That's it. So I'm going to put it in and 0. And I also have to determine this. Natural log of 5. Natural log 5. That's 1.6. And now we have to study the sign of this. But I'm hoping that you're going to refuse to study the sign of x squared plus 5, because x squared plus 5 will always be
Positive.
Yes. So we have to study the sign of 2x, or just x, of course, to the left of 0.
Negative.
Yes, of course. And to the right of 0. Awesome. So then, can anyone tell us what type of point is 0, comma? So obviously, from 2.3 goes down, and it goes up, and it goes up, and it comes down. So what type of point is 0, comma 1.6? We identified these two, but now we also have to identify 0, comma 1.6. What type of point is it?
A minimum.
Yes. Now, I didn't tell you, but what I taught you before we got to this section was first derivative test. What is it? The first derivative test says if this is a critical number and the sign changes this way, that's a relative min. If it changes the opposite way, it's a relative max. But now let's also talk about the second derivative test, which personally I never use. I used to check, but I never really use otherwise the second derivative test. But I want to explain what it is. Let's suppose somebody says, which I think is wrong, somebody says, I don't want to study the sign of the first derivative. If I don't study the sign of the first derivative, I may have an error here, and then I go to the second derivative, and then I have a bigger error there. So that's why I cannot stop and not make sure that these two rows work well together. I cannot. But others say this: I don't want to study the sign of the first derivative. But if the function has a critical number, and the function, the second derivative tells us that the function opens up, what type of point can 0, 1, comma 6 be? 1.6 be? What can it be? If the function opens this way, and the derivative, the first derivative, is 0 at 0, and the y value is 1.6. What type of point can this be if the second derivative is positive here? What kind of point can it be if it opens like this?
A minimum.
Yes, and if it's a minimum, obviously the sign has to be negative and positive. It cannot be the other way around. So that's what the second derivative test says. If there is a critical number in an interval where the function opens upward, this critical number must give a minimum. If there is a critical number where the function or the second derivative says the function opens upward, that must be a maximum. So I recommend stick with the first derivative test, study the sign, make sure that these two rows work well together, And at the very end, when you finish with the second derivative, say, okay, let me see, is this okay? Yeah, it's okay. This is a relative minimum. The first derivative changes sign this way. And at this point, the function opens upward. So obviously 0, 1.6 must be a relative minimum. So I recommend that type of usage of the second derivative test. Or you can say no. It takes me too long, or I don't want to study the sign of the first derivative. I will get the sign after I finish the second derivative. But if I have an error in the first, I will never get anything correct anymore. So it's up to you. Any questions? Any questions from me?